Welcome to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we welcome you to the 899th production of the North Idaho College Public Forum. Next week will be another milestone. We will produce our 900th program. Today's program should be most informative and interesting to you. We wish to welcome to our program two guests that come to us from the Idaho chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union. Our guest on the program is, to my far left, Jack Van Valdenberg, who is the executive director of the Idaho chapter. And next to him is Alan Kofad, who is the president of the Idaho chapter. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. We're most pleased to have you here, and we want to discuss a number of topics, not only about how you organize, but also some of the issues such as First Amendment questions. And I'm very pleased to have two of our regular panel members with us today to question our guest. First of all, Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And I shall ask Janelle to commence the questioning.
Well, gentlemen, it's very nice to have you here today. Can you tell us just what is the ACLU, or the American Civil Liberties Union? What kinds of questions and issues do you focus on?
Jack?
Well, it's a 70-year-old organization that was established to protect the Bill of Rights, essentially. The history of the American Civil Liberties Union since then is the history, in great part, of the Supreme Court litigation since then. We are now, and have been for a number of years, the entity, the largest public interest law firm in the country is what some call us, because we go to the Supreme Court, and we're in more courts in the nation than any other organization or entity outside of the federal government. We are an organization devoted particularly to protecting individual civil liberties against government attack. That would mean First Amendment protections of freedom of speech, freedom of religion. It would mean Fourth Amendment protections and freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures, the rights of privacy, 14th Amendment rights to be free from discrimination, and the rights for equal protection. Those are the fundamental concerns we have.
Some people might think of you as an organization of lawyers. Are you necessarily an organization of lawyers? You say you're a public interest law firm. Are you an organization of lawyers?
Not really. It's a good question, because there is a misapprehension out there that you have to be an attorney to be involved in ACLU. That's not true. I think there are a large number of attorneys who become involved because through the process of law school, I think you develop a greater appreciation for how fragile freedom is, how hard fought those freedoms were in the first place, how easy it would be to let them slip away from us. And so I think attorneys tend to be very cognizant and concerned about them, but by no means is it limited to attorneys.
So anyone could be a member of the ACLU?
Yes.
Now, once you have, let's say, an issue comes to your attention, do you file the lawsuit, or how does that work? What is that process?
Well, generally in Idaho, we get a complaint. We don't litigate unless we have a complaint that we see as facially valid, that it's a constitutional deprivation. And we talk because we're just a small chapter compared to some of the major affiliates in the nation, like California and New York. We work in conjunction with the regional office in Denver, and there is a staff attorney on board full-time to litigate, essentially, who handles 11 states, so he's got a large responsibility. But we work with him closely, and we find a cooperating attorney, meaning a volunteer attorney. Most of the litigation that the ACLU does is by volunteer attorneys. And we essentially don't litigate unless there's no alternative. We seek to avoid going to court, but when we cannot avoid it, then we file suit and work closely with the individual plaintiffs.
Do you also do friend of the court kinds of briefs and that sort of thing, amicus curiae?
We do. Recently we filed an amicus brief in the Rhodes case because the Idaho legislature attempted to repeal or abolish the insanity defense, and that's an issue of concern to ACLU because essentially you have people who may have committed a murder, but they're so mentally deranged and unstable that it's hard to hold them fully responsible for what they did in the usual legal analysis. I mean, the difference is that typically a person would be committed to the insane asylum rather than sent to the state prison. But I think that's preferable, and we do, in cases like that, submit cases in when the case is already on appeal.
Steve Sheen.
Jack and Alan, are you both employees of the American Civil Liberties Union?
Jack is recently an employee, and I have never been paid anything. I do this strictly on a volunteer basis, and because I think it's so important to educate people and make people realize the importance of preserving the freedom that we have. So I spend a lot of time, I don't get paid for it. I really am a business lawyer, and I have a lot of people say, Alan, why on earth do you do this ACLU stuff? And I say, one, because it's fun, and two, because it's so important.
All right. I was very interested to note your earlier response that most members of ACLU are not attorneys. If they aren't attorneys, who are they? What kind of people join the organization, and how do they further the causes of ACLU if they're not in the courtroom?
People from all walks of life are involved. They give money. We have accountants who act as treasurers and help us keep track of the financial requirements and whatnot that we have. Volunteers who make phone calls and write the legislature. There is a ton of work to be done. It's not hard to find something for someone to do.
And there are a lot of members who don't have the time to commit but still want to get our newsletter and still care enough about civil liberties, so they join the organization. And that's really the bulk of the membership. And that comes, as Alan said, from all walks of life. But it just takes somebody who thinks about their rights and thinks about the principles that allow us to live as Americans in the American way of life. And given enough thought on that, many people would join.
Jack, does ACLU ever represent anyone on a fee basis, or are its services always free?
We represent on a fee basis insofar as court fees we get, but no, individuals do not pay us fees. In fact, in Idaho and throughout the nation, the ACLU is funded in part by the fees that the government has to pay when they lose a case. Those fees are awarded to the prevailing attorney. When there are volunteer attorneys on board of a case for the ACLU, those volunteer attorneys turn those fees over to the ACLU. Sometimes it's shared with the attorney to pay their costs too.
Are those fees sufficient to cover the full cost of the organization, or are there membership dues, other sources of revenue?
It's largely funded from membership contributions, and there are many Americans who feel so strongly about preserving the Bill of Rights that they give thousands of dollars every year to the American Civil Liberties Union. Another thing I think it's important to realize is that we focus our attention to a large extent on education and working with the legislature ahead of time, because it's always easier to prevent something from happening than to undo it after it's been done. Typically with the courts, you're trying to undo some damage that's already been done or get a law declared unconstitutional. And we've really had good luck in the past couple years. So Jack von Valkenburg and Janet Krebs, who's also an attorney, have acted as legislative coordinators for us. And I think every legislative bill that we found problems with in the last session, there were about 10, we got it changed before it was enacted into law. So we really, I think we've saved the taxpayers a lot of money. And it's not because legislators are bad people or they're trying to infringe on constitutional rights. Usually they have a good goal in mind. And these things come up in fish and game bills and in things you would never expect. But in trying to affect a laudable goal, they don't realize that they really are chipping away at the Bill of Rights. And our goal, and I think the importance of ACLU, is make people realize the big picture, keep history in mind, and just look at the big picture of what's going on. And usually when legislators know that there are some problems, they will react to it. Plato said to know the good is to do the good, and our experience is that that's pretty true.
Well, gentlemen, I know you want to get to the very heart of the Constitution, and so we'll just dive right in. Particularly in the First Amendment to the Constitution, you do an awful lot of work, and because you take a lot of cases that are very high profile and there's a lot of controversy involved, you have been very much criticized by more conservative forces in the country. And it's my understanding from watching the actions of the ACLU that your belief in free speech and freedom of the press and right to assemble and religious freedom is a really big area. And you have defended in the past nationally organizations that have asked to assemble that can be labeled as communist, those that have been the Nazi Party, the very famous case in Chicago where you defended the right of Nazi organization to march in a Jewish community. And I know you lost a lot of members because of your belief in that right to assemble. It's a very long introduction to a question, but the question is, what do you say to Americans who criticize you when you're defending the First Amendment and that you're defending individuals or organizations that are really anti-democratic as to their principles and beliefs? Would you like to start with that one, Alan?
Oh, I'd love to. The problem is, and ACLU is always identified with the speech of the people we happen to be defending in the particular situation, but what we are protecting is freedom of speech. If you look at history, you find that always people want to make exceptions. Freedom of speech is fine as long as somebody isn't saying something we disagree with. And I think as Americans, we're to a point where we tend to forget that one of the foundations of American society is that though I may disagree with what you say, I will defend to the death your right to say it. And that's our position. And our great fear is, people say, well, don't defend the Nazis, they're bad people, so we don't care if they have freedom of speech or not. Well, that's fine. But if you let it slip away there, then the next thing you know, when you want to say something and somebody doesn't like it, you won't have freedom of speech either because all these exceptions have been whittled away until nothing is left.
And Jack, I'd like to pursue that with you. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of states have passed, and in many cases they've been written very, very carefully, that when we have groups that we call hate groups assemble, those laws indicate that you have a right to assemble, and even when they assemble, they may preach racism, they may even burn crosses. But where do you draw the line in legislation? When does speech turn into action that is illegal? Would you explain the position from the viewpoint of the ACLU and how that relates to the Constitution?
Well, we take a very pure approach to the First Amendment and believe that when it's expression, be it speech, be it music, be it art, it deserves protection. You don't turn the power of the decision over to another person as to what is good and what is not good speech. If it's speech, you allow it to go forward. If you don't like the speech, the best way to counter that is by more speech, by somebody who disagrees with it taking it upon themselves to speak out above it. And that's the way that society progresses. That's the way that, I believe that America is going and the world is going, that Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union is going. And I think that you don't really draw a line when it's purely conduct, certainly. You don't allow somebody to hit somebody over the head, but when it's speech or when it's art or when it's music or some form of expression, that deserves protection.
And I was making that distinction between speech and action when
Mm-hmm.
the action becomes illegal, as if it infringes upon the right of another person.
Certainly. We don't allow or don't support any action that impinges on somebody else's rights. But I think it's a clear line.
Janelle Burke.
One of the most recent controversies has involved the separation of church and state. Does your position mean that you are anti-religion, or can you explain a little bit exactly how you decide, or where do you draw the line, and what are the issues here? What are the underlying issues, as well as what appears to be the forefront issues?
Mm-hmm. Another good question, which is really one of the main reasons we've come on this trip, because it really has been in the news quite a lot lately. Again, we're subject to some bad public relations in that people think because we support separation of church and state, we're somehow against religion, and that is absolutely not true. The ACLU historically has always supported and defended people's religious beliefs, freedom of conscience, to a large degree. The problem is that we strongly believe, and it's supported by the First Amendment, that you can't really have freedom of religion, freedom of spiritual belief, unless you have a strict separation of church and state. If you start mixing the two, in a way it's like mixing alcohol and gunpowder. I think you're asking for trouble. And what typically happens is in an area you have a dominant religion, and once the state and that religion start joining forces, then anybody who's not a member of that church is subject to being an outsider at the minimum, if not being subjected to more coercive action to get them into the church, to make them fall in line. And we really have problems on this because people in small communities, I grew up in Grangeville, Idaho, I was born and raised there, and right now that is one of our problem areas because you've got a lot of Christians and well-meaning people, and they cannot understand why it's bad to have prayer in school. Why can it be bad to have Bibles in the school? Because these are good things. Well, the problem is that you've got to look at the big picture. And putting yourself in someone else's shoes perhaps helps. Now, if we took some of the people in Grangeville feel very strongly about this and put them in Antelope, Oregon, when the Rajneeshis moved in and suddenly became the majority force in the county, and what if they did not have a guarantee of separation of church and state in that situation? All of a sudden, they would be enforcing the worship of Rajneesh in the public school. And it's the same thing. You've got to look at the big picture. You've got to maintain that separation everywhere. Otherwise, minority religions are always going to be subject to discrimination. I've been criticized recently because we have sued the southeastern Idaho schools where the Mormon Church has very close ties. The majority of people are LDS. They cannot see a problem with having church activities in the school. But people are saying to me, Alan, you guys are after the Mormons in southeastern Idaho, and Grangeville, your hometown, is distributing Bibles and having prayer in school and spitting in the face of the Bill of Rights, and what are you going to do about it? And I said, well, they're next. I'm hoping that the force of logic will compel them to change their mind, but I'm not so sure.
What about the well-meaning individual who may not recognize what the difference of separation of church and state means?
Yeah, well, it was Justice Brandeis who said essentially that the greatest threat to liberty lies in the overzealousness of individuals, well-intentioned individuals, good-hearted individuals. And as Alan was saying, you've just got to take a look at the big picture. We need to educate more than anything, I think, in this day and age. We need to educate. I should back up to explain that for the last 30 years, the ACLU has won over 2/3 of its cases in court, but in the last year, we've won less than half. That's because the President Reagan's appointees are taking a hold at the Supreme Court. We're not winning like we used to when we realized that we've got to focus on education. We've got to focus in the legislatures of the state. And we need, and I think this road trip that Alan and I are taking to Coeur d'Alene, Moscow, Grangeville, Lewiston in the next few days is an effort, part of a larger effort of the ACLU to awaken people to the need to understand the Bill of Rights and the need for protection of civil liberties, so we don't need to go to the Supreme Court, where now we have no great assurance that we'll win.
Steve Sheen.
Let me follow up on that a minute, if I may. What do you say to the well-meaning individual who has just listened to your explanation and says, fine, we'll make sure that any religious activity in any public entity is non-denominational. So in that way, we'll ensure that the dominant religion in an area doesn't discriminate against minority religions.
Okay, but it does necessarily discriminate against people. You cannot have freedom of religious belief unless you have the absolute freedom to believe whatever you want to, which includes the freedom of non-belief. I do not have freedom of spiritual belief unless I have the freedom to not believe certain things that people want me to believe. And people say non-denominational prayer. Well, prayer is a religious activity. And the ideal is separation of church and state, separation of government and religious activity. So to make it non-denominational, people always try to do that, and there has been litigation on it. Usually they're not, they're non-denominational, but they're still invoking deities and praying to gods that some people may believe in and some people don't.
This has got to be one of your toughest areas. Is obscenity a similar one? We talked about freedom of expression, freedom of speech a minute ago. Do you run into the same sort of very strongly held beliefs and emotional arguments when it comes to those people who would say freedom of expression is one thing, but this is clearly obscene, why can't you see that?
Yes, we certainly do. I mean, people believe that they have the right to speak, but others don't have the right to speak when they start to disagree with them or when they start to say things that they don't like. And, you know, that'll come into play, and people will get most riled when it's something that's anti-religious or when it's something that's obscene or some way totally offensive. And where, you know, that's just dictated by the times and the people who you're speaking to. We can't have those artificial lines drawn anymore. I think the world is big enough, and people are big enough now, and we've got to have the confidence. I mean, this is the land of the free and the home of the brave, and we've got to be confident that we can withstand free speech, and we're not going to suffer because there is obscenity or there are atheists out there in the world. We don't need to do away with those people. Everybody can speak, and if your notion catches on, if your speech catches on, then people will rally around you.
Have you noticed any trends in Idaho, areas where you feel that the work of ACLU is being most strongly threatened?
Well, the big one right now is separation of church and state. Frankly, I have a fear that while everybody's focused on that, and there's really a much greater battle going on, and the war on drugs is really kind of a catalyst for what I fear could be, if we're not very, very careful, a war on civil liberties. What's going on behind the scenes, and which is not in the news very much, is a constant erosion in the courts, in the legislatures, and in public opinion for the rights of privacy, the right to be free from governmental searches. Whenever you have a war, you have hysteria, and I think right now in the war on drugs, you've got hysteria. People don't realize that what I think the result will be is people are willing to trade their civil liberties in order to root out drugs, but I'm sure that what we're going to end up with, if that happens, is a police state, and we will still have drugs. America is the only country in the world that has the degree of individual liberty that we do, guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. No other country in the world has that, but almost every country in the world has drug problems. And the other problem with the war on drugs is that people don't realize that hundreds of thousands of people die every year from legal drugs, and most particularly alcohol. The drug that is most widely associated with violent behavior is alcohol. It's not an illegal drug. A couple thousand people die every year from cocaine overdoses, and 200,000 people approximately die every year from alcohol. A couple 100,000 people die every year from cigarette-related things. So my fear is, one, it takes our focus off some of the real problems that we've got, and two, there's a feeling of abandonment that we've got to root this out no matter what the cost, and if it means giving away the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, so be it.
There's two areas I want to get into. One of them is, before time is up, often again when you are criticized by some organizations in the country, you are categorized as a very liberal organization, you defend liberal causes. How would you respond to the fact that you do also defend conservative positions and conservative organizations? Is that correct?
Well, I have to make a distinction between conservative and authoritarian. Mm-hmm. And authoritarians are people who want everybody to believe as they do and think as they do and have the same religion and do things the same way. The ACLU is the most conservative organization in America. I mean, if protecting the Bill of Rights and limiting government involvement in individual lives, if that isn't a conservative ideal, I don't know what is. It's the authoritarians, I think, typically who label us liberals because we get in the way when they want to put more people in jail and when they want to take away freedom.
I have also a question on the issue of privacy that's come up a couple of times, and you referred earlier to the fact that not only do you defend a lot of First Amendment issues, but you defend Fourth Amendment questions, particularly against unreasonable search and seizure. And oftentimes in looking at the Constitution, we delve into not only the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable search and seizures, and I guess my comment would be that if there is no right to privacy, then why would you have the issue of search and seizures? I mean, the issue of privacy would have to be part of protecting one against certain searches, and also the issue of the Ninth Amendment. Mr. Bork, when he was appointed to the court, or attempted to be appointed to the court, during the hearings he indicated that he did not believe that the Constitution protected privacy. In taking a counter position as you do, what would you say to our viewers about the constitutional issue of privacy?
We think it's fundamentally important. In fact, we hope to launch again this winter's legislative session a campaign for a right of privacy to be introduced and passed by the legislature, a constitutional amendment such as exists in Montana, Alaska, Washington states, all have provisions, and about 10 or 15 other states have provisions for a right of privacy that's explicitly in the Constitution. We do have a right of privacy in Idaho and everywhere in the United States, thanks to the U.S. Supreme Court's interpretation that's clear in the Bill of Rights, but it's not spelled out as a right of privacy. If we had it explicitly in the Idaho Constitution, it would strengthen that clause.
Jack, did I hear you saying there that in case that the court becomes more or actually the court changes its interpretation, I'll watch what I say ideologically, but if the court changes its position and becomes more willing to declare that the privacy is not in the Constitution, or not to the extent that you think, by writing into the Idaho Constitution, isn't there some precedent set in states like Oregon now that the state Constitution must guarantee all the rights you have in the U.S. Constitution, but can go beyond that and even provide more extensive rights?
Our Constitution has already been interpreted by the Idaho Supreme Court as not being limited to even if the wording's the same as a clause in the U.S. Constitution, it need not be limited to that. And we would hope that the Idaho Constitution could include that right of privacy to further expand that.
In the 1980s, wasn't that true in the Chrisman case before the U.S. Supreme Court, and it came back to the Washington Supreme Court, where actually privacy is more protected in the Washington Constitution than the U.S. Constitution?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
The same is true in Idaho. Under the Idaho Constitution, separation of church and state is about as clear as it could be. Even more so, and I think partially because we had another 100 years of history after the Federal Bill of Rights was enacted.
But a few years ago, the Montana Constitution was adopted, a new constitution, and it actually uses the very word privacy.
Yes,
in the document.
And in this day and age especially, what with the technological innovations and the transfer of data as to one's credit and bank
I'm going to have to interrupt. I get the signal we're out of time. I want to thank both of you gentlemen for being with us and the panel for your fine questions. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope you've enjoyed our program. We'd like to invite you next week to be with us on our milestone program, the 900th program. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.
So much money, turf wars over the money at stake.
Cynthia, why don't you come over and state your question? Prosecuting attorney, and
put the cameras back. It's one
I
thing
really
to
believe seriously.
Yeah.
I hate to say it because of the fear that you give up on a whole generation of young people, but I think we need to consider whether we're ever going to win a war against drugs, and whether it makes more sense to legalize them and put your effort into and rehabilitation. Yeah.
creating another huge criminal organization like we did back
In Prohibition.
in Prohibition, exactly.
And we spend $10 billion of tax money, which creates $100 billion every year.
This program, with that kind of stuff, how are you ever going to read?
That's right. I'm serious. I'm dead serious. Well, and what really you look, you can see the drug policy, the zero tolerance. All it's really is to concentrate the drug power in like the Colombian mafia.
I made this program possible.
It really is consolidated.
Bring your mouse, your lights down, your ground mount.
Okay.
I gotta run.
Thank you.
Good to meet you both. Enjoyed it very much.
Yes, very nice.
Our pleasure.
Just love it.
Some of the questions were
was the answer.
Great honor.
You know what I really want to do.
Yeah.
One, two.
I
Serious business.
understand questions.
I can
Would you like to
We'll sit down.
Everybody was very well. This one, we got our two presentations.
For an organization.